Okay, there. Okay, so Graeme has 20 years of experience studying the spatial ecology and behavior of large herbivores and the effects of anthropogenic disturbance on wildlife. His research addresses applied questions in wildlife biology using the latest animal tracking technology in conjunction with novel experimental paradigms and behavioral observations. So if you want to go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
Sure, that might just take me a little while. I'm not the best, as I mentioned, but here we go. And you hear me fine, yeah?
Yep.
Great. How's that looking?
Great.
Give better presentations. What? Okay, so is that now full screen, Jesse? You see?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks, Jesse, and thanks to the rest of all of you who've come along today. Thanks for the introduction as well, and it's very nice to kind of meet up again with Jesse after what must be 7 years, I think, since we left Colorado when we were working there. And a lot of the work I'm going to talk about today was from the last 8 years or so with a partnership with Colorado State University, where I was a postdoctoral researcher, but done in collaboration with MPS, and I've continued on in my position as a lecturer in zoology at Bangor University. But to begin with, let me just check I'll always start with a bit of a Venn diagram, always nice. Just give you a bit of background on my research career before diving into the anthropogenic noise side of things. So my work it kind of covers all these three huge subject areas. And so I very much started off in conservation from my master's degree, which is now over 20 years ago. Then moved into more behavioral ecology, or actually probably more ecology, then behavioral ecology, and then behavior. So I kind of went counterclockwise around this Venn diagram. They're very much cognitive behavior, mechanisms of behavior. But I've actually moved back more to what I would say is an applied behavioral ecologist. So at the nexus of this diagram is where I'm happiest. So using behavior to understand applied questions. And that mainly focuses on social mammal species. And these are just a few of the ones I've worked on. And these have allowed us to study things like sexual dimorphism. Just had a paper out looking at that in the common hippo, which has been quite an exciting study using a 6-year-old data set, but also the spatial use of landscapes by large herbivores in North America, and now expanding that to Europe with studies with PhD students and master students on fallow deer here in Wales. So we've got quite a nice population that we've been studying now for the best part of just gone 4 years. And then also studying anthropogenic noise and the prairie dog up at the top right, which I'm going to discuss in more detail as I go on, and kind of signifies that. So the commonality, I guess, is social mammals, but they've been great for a variety of different projects. But it's the African elephant that has been at the core of much of my research over the last 20 years, and the species for first 12, 15 years of my career that I really focused on. And that was from the very much doing the conservation sides where I started, moving behavioral ecology, and then behavior, as I mentioned. And in fact, it was elephants that got me interested in the acoustic sides of both from a method approach, for studying animal behavior, but also a fascination in the vocalizations that elephants are making, which are quite complex in their own right, as I'm sure you're aware. So this indirectly, and I'll get into a bit further, provided me with some experience and led to the anthropogenic noise research. It was a change in the way that I was thinking about sound, but I was first introduced to it and first thinking about acoustics when I was working with elephants. That's in East Africa. This is actually a photo from the Masai Mara in southern Kenya. And this must be about 6-7 years ago, working on a project there with Liverpool University, but also worked extensively down in South Africa as well in a number of game reserves, which is where I did my PhD. But I'll return to that a little bit later on. Right, I'd like to begin at the landscape scale. Actually, not really the landscape scale at all, is it? It's the countrywide scale. I think this is an absolutely brilliant map that was generated by colleagues at the National Park Service. I wasn't involved in this, but this kind of almost continental wide scale noise map that I'm sure you might well be familiar with. I think what's the detail in it is fascinating, but just the visual of how acoustic environments have been altered over such large areas just gives us a concept and a kind of an idea of the extensive nature of and how pervasive human noise is, and how relatively recent it is evolutionarily anyway. So this diagram and the east-west split has always fascinated me. I know that it goes along population lines and density of road networks and urban areas, but just fascinating how you can see obviously the yellow areas are areas of raised noise levels above ambient, whereas blue is closer to ambient. We can just see that across the US. We need something like this in Europe. I'm sure that there would be a lot more yellow, even more so in densely populated countries like the UK, but it really allows you to map out the extent of acoustically altered environments. So I always think that's a good place to start from, rather than maybe diving down straight into a study, just kind of giving that, but I'm sure everyone's familiar with that. And that's what we did with the start of the noise research that now I began nearly 9 years ago. We were trying to get a grasp on what had been done and what had been understood in the field. This was probably 2013, 14 when we kicked this off. So we wanted to do a noise review looking at all noise. Now, often they've been done according to the environments, whether it was terrestrial or aquatic, and we wanted to look across all of them, or at least that was my aim, to be as ambitious as possible. And this is work that I did with the whole group, both at CSU and NPS, which Jesse was also involved with. And it was quite an ambitious undertaking with systematic review. And the first figure here basically is just looking at publication rate and the number of papers that have published over time from the early 90s, which was when we started. So it almost covered 2.5 decades, pretty much, this review. And we can see that it really ramps up in terms of the number of publications. Unsurprisingly, late kind of 2008, 9, 10 onwards, it really increases quite dramatically. And this is probably stimulated by arguably a few studies, but two I've picked out here. One was the stranding of marine mammals, which was linked to naval sonar back in the late 90s, which generated lots of interest for obvious reasons. And the second was studies, particularly the Slabakorn 2003 paper, showing that great tits were raising the frequency of their calls in traffic noise or in urban noise. And that seemed to be a way of adapting so they weren't being masked, they were able to call, and they were urban adaptive species. And this triggered a great deal of work from there on. So our review, first off, was just to look at the number of papers. Another thing we did was, I was playing around with like word clouds at the time, just to kind of present work and the range of studies, because we had over 258, I think we're in, or 262 actually, I think was the final count of studies at the point when we were doing this, that had studied anthropogenic noise in whatever species, aquatic or terrestrial, as I mentioned. Took all the abstracts and titles, put them into a word cloud, and obviously the words that are the most prominent are the ones that are repeated more often throughout. So if we clear that up a little bit, we can see, unsurprisingly, bird comes out, and we'll get to that in a second. Urban, communication, acoustic, response, effect, behavior. The things you would expect, these they've been studied to the greatest extent, and they're going to be repeated. What was more of a surprise, though, if we go back to that, is actually conservation. I'm not sure if anyone's spotted it yet, but that's conservation. It actually didn't pop up nearly as much as you'd expect, given the applied nature of the issue associated with anthropogenic noise. It was very much being studied mechanistically, behaviourally, but the links to conservation seemed not that strong, at least at this stage. I definitely think this has changed over time. This is a study that came out in 2016, and we were working on a couple of years before that, but we found that quite intriguing, that there wasn't this strong link. Again, this behaviour to conservation, almost the two fields don't always overlap as much as they might. In terms of taxonomic representation, again, this shows that terrestrially, birds are just great species for this, obvious reasons. The vocalization, ease of study, or relative ease of study, not always the case. and they just lend themselves to it. They're urban adapted. They can be studied in a range of environments. And some of these seminal papers started off studying birds, which probably triggered more research in the same vein. Likewise in the aquatic field, and that led the way, particularly the marine research, as they were well ahead of us in the terrestrial environment. And marine mammals, they were coming up with really intriguing ways of studying marine mammals and their response to anthropogenic noise, and that reflects itself in the literature. There's a lot more data available, a lot more studies on marine mammals. Whereas if we move down a bit, terrestrial mammals only represent 11%, or did at the time, fish 15%, amphibians 4%, and invertebrates, and that goes across aquatic and terrestrial, just 4%, I believe. I can't actually see for the Zoom, but I believe that's 4%, so very low. So we can see there's a bit of a bias in terms of taxonomic representation, particularly towards birds and marine mammals. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does indicate where a lot of the work is done so far. And then we look at behavioural response categories, and this is also intriguing, but probably not surprising. Again, thinking about those early studies and how amenable birds are for studying vocal communication, and that they were, and marine mammals for that matter, the vocal behaviour represents 33, like a third of all studies look at vocal behaviour. Movement is the next big one, and then physiology. They make a good portion of all the studies studying those three biological responses. But we move down there and we can see the actual behaviours that might be important, fitness behaviours such as vigilance and foraging, mating behaviour, are actually probably underrepresented when you think about it in terms of these key behaviours and the studying them, and whether there's a response, an immediate response to noise that we can measure that way. And then at the community level metrics, only 1%. And that is just the challenge of studying that over the long term and showing that noise definitively has community level metrics changes. Although there are studies that have probably, well, there are a number of studies that have now looked into that and are expanding on that. And I think the ecological connection is really important. In terms of the change in vocal behaviour, there's two key ways, and they're not exclusive. One is by the animal shifting its frequency, as we mentioned with the great tits in Holland. So pushing up the frequency to escape the masking of low frequency traffic noise or urban noise. And the other is, as the bird on the bottom here is showing, is just increasing the amplitude. Some birds do both, some just are the one of those two mechanisms, but that's the change of vocal behavior. And there's a link with those birds that are able to be more flexible and adaptive, that they are actually better adapted to urban environments or noisy environments. Another thing we looked at with this was trying to map a cumulative evidence response. And this was really challenging, as I'm sure Jesse remembers as well, because we had all these 262 studies, all using different acoustic metrics. And obviously measuring sound is tricky at the best of times, but you've got lots of different metrics. Not all the studies were very good at necessarily reporting their metrics. And then you've got a whole host of different biological responses, right from the behavioural end to the community level or the fitness. But what we tried to do was put this cumulative evidence response. So basically the number of studies or the percentage of studies that showed a response at a certain level. And it's very preliminary. We've got to be cautious. It's not dose response, because many studies just picked an arbitrary or a level of noise they only studied. They didn't go any less or didn't go any lower or higher on those thresholds to see whether behavioural responses were recorded. But what it does show us is that there's this kind of increasing levels of noise, just measured as a dB, because obviously you've got all the different acoustic metrics and the colours. We see this increasing evidence that there is response. And 20% of the studies actually document responses below 50 dBA, which is quite interesting. And again, I hasten to add that there may well be responses well below that. This is just what we happen to have looked at. These are the noise levels we happen to have looked at. And the dark line, the solid line underneath, is a human annoyance curve at different levels, so of exposure to urban noise. So as you can see, the proportion of the human population that report irritation to sound levels rapidly increases and follows pretty much what we see with the cumulative evidence of response for wildlife, except for wildlife, it's not just a mere irritant, it might be a life and death scenario of life and death importance. Research recommendations that came expanding geographic and taxonomic sampling. I mentioned the taxonomy, so I won't go into that. Geographically, again, unsurprising, most of the work has been done in Northern America and Europe. There are others, but really some of the most biodiverse regions of the planet don't have much research at all done in terms of the impacts of noise. And that really needs to expand. Exploring interacting effects of noise with other forms of human pollution and human disturbance has started to increase. There's a lot of, well, there's a good deal of research now looking at the effects of light and noise. Removing or reducing noise, so kind of taking it out of the environment and seeing what the response is and the change in behavior over time. There's some experiments that are starting to look at that. And then also measuring it over a gradient of noise response, rather than a lot of studies, including the ones I'll probably talk about today, tend to be a sound, either the presence of noise or the absence of noise, a single value or a single noise level, rather than maybe looking at the gradient of noise. And those dose responses definitely have been done more in the marine environment than maybe we have done terrestrially, but with playback experiments, there's potential to increase that. Recovery after a significant noise event, and that could be done both in natural experiments and playback approaches. And then investing in larger scale, this is a real challenge, in large scale studies that look at large spatial scales, and obviously also over temporal, larger temporal scales as well, be really important. And then the last two are evaluating mitigation measures to see what actually works if we're trying to reduce noise and reduce the impact of noise in the environment. And as I mentioned earlier, that the reporting of acoustic metrics, we were quite surprised how bad that was and how varied, depending upon the journal and the article, that there was often just a dB level given with no noise metric, no filter, no duration, no frequency, no spectrogram was quite common. To get all of the net data you need to accurately compare and maybe even repeat a study was, in the minority of studies, I'd say less than 20%. So doing any kind of systematic review of meta is limited if you don't know the challenge of measuring sound in more than just one dimension. Means that you need that data to be able to explore what noise actually was and to quantify it. From now on, I'm going to, in this talk, I want to talk about one specific form of noise, but a ubiquitous one, and that's road noise. And we chose this because obviously roads cover a huge portion of the planet, terrestrially, obviously, and they have a kind of cylindrical waveform that forms from them, and they can permeate at large distances from the road into surrounding habitats. And roads themselves are a major source for habitat fragmentation. I found this stat, I didn't quite believe it, having lived in the US and know how large the US is, but the fact that 83% of the area, the lower 48 states, is actually within 1 kilometre of a road, which seemed quite amazing to me. I just wonder what it is in the UK, for example. And we've got these facts like the global road travel is set to double in 40 years, and we'll have 25 million lane kilometres of road construction as well. So not only for the habitat fragmentation, which is this really bad news, but also the increase in noise into habitats that may well otherwise have had pretty intact acoustic environments. And that's just the kind of a similar map to the noise map that I showed at the beginning across the lower 48 states, and showing the distance, average distance to road. And the key is on the right side. It's a bit obscured by the zoom icons that I have down the right hand side, but hopefully you can see that. Okay, on to now measuring the effects of anthropogenic noise on behaviour. So this photo was taken along I-25 in Denver and Fort Collins, and after that photo was taken, I narrowly avoided getting arrested by a local patrol officer. He came skidding up in his patrol car, jumped out, and demanded to know I was pointing a gun at the cars passing on the highway. And I spoke as clearly as possible, but he was very mistrusting of my British accent. So luckily I had two colleagues with me who said that it wasn't a gun, it was in fact a microphone. I think a passing motorist got a bit confused, but it did cause some excitement. Anyway, he was happy to let us do our recording, and we got an hour of road noise recorded at peak. This was at rush hour, it's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. But with studies of noise, there's a variety of ways obviously we can look at this. And in the past, one of the key ways was looking at using the road as a natural experiment. It's very effective. You just take increasing distances from the road to explore effects on population metrics, could be abundance, diversity of species, or even behavior, and see how those change with increasing distance and infer that in terms of noise, because you can also measure the noise at these different distances, and obviously close to the road is going to be higher, further away from the road the noise will drop off. The problem being is that you have very many confounding variables, as this image shows, including the traffic itself, the altered habitat, the chemical pollution, the presence of humans. And how do you tease that apart from the singular effect of noise itself, just the acoustic change of the environment? And that can be challenging with these natural experiment studies, which don't control that so well. But one of the very effective ways that, again, has been championed both in marine and terrestrial environments. Marine environments probably, again, I would imagine, first and foremost, coming up with these novel approaches, but done to very effectively also with a number of bird studies in the, just before we started our research in 2012-13, looking at the changes in abundance of bird species that are exposed to noise in an absence of all the other disturbance. So you just play the noise, whatever the recording is. I think the top one here, we had the sage grouse was using drilling noise, drill rig noise from oil and gas drill rigs. And the bottom one is using a phantom road, which was led by Jesse Barber's group from Boise State University in Idaho. And they actually set up a phantom road in the woodlands and looked at it in terms of the distribution of migratory birds, which was really effective, because essentially now is you're just presenting with noise without any other disturbance, so you can actually quantify what that effect is. So it's very powerful. Certainly there are challenges in doing this long term, but it is, a playback experiment is quite a powerful approach for quantifying effects where you can control these confounding variables. And I mentioned that I had some experience in terms of getting into elephant vocalizations and acoustics from the work I'd done in East and Southern Africa. And this was indeed the case, because one of the studies I was involved with between 2006 and 2012 was exploring the cognitive behavior of African elephants, particularly matriarchs and their family groups. And to do this, to get into the heads of elephants, we used acoustics. I worked with Karen McComb at Sussex University, who comes up with these brilliant experiments to kind of give elephants a realistic scenario of social or ecological threat, and then see how the elephants respond according to the composition of the group, the age of the matriarch. So we had this specially built speaker built by a bespoke speaker company here in the UK. And they really liked the challenge, because we needed to be able to recreate authentic elephant rumbles. And an elephant rumble can be as low as 10, 12 hertz. So really low. So you don't normally want that in stereo equipment, because our hearing threshold is above that. It can create resonance. So normally you don't have it as low level. Your frequency response is what we needed. So they came up with a speaker that was really robust. It was about 1 meter cubed. It weighed about 95 kilos. It needed 2 big car batteries to drive it, but it produced the most epic kind of elephant rumbles, because we'd record these contact calls close to the elephants and then play it back. So we'd know who'd recorded, and we could play it back to different groups and see how they responded to different individuals of age and dominance. And we did the same thing. The speaker was also tweaked so that it would work for us to play lion roars, which are very different acoustically, and they've got much higher range frequency-wise. A much more dynamic range, actually, and we would use that to play threat, and we did that by playing different numbers of lions to the elephants to see if they could assess numerical threat acoustically. So I really got into this from playback, for me, being like studying elephant behavior and cognition and the ability to deal with complex decision making on ecological and social threat, whereas now I was flipping this on its head and using the playback experiment to study how anthropogenic disturbance was affecting more key core behaviors of species. So yeah, so anyway, just a quick recap. We play the sound to the elephant group at the top right there, and then I would film the response, either often sitting on top of the vehicle from 100 meters. We tried to keep it the same every time. The elephants were relaxed beforehand, play that, record it, and then analyze the videos for behavior afterwards to see what was happening. Right, back to anthropogenic noise. So in the early days of being in the US, I think I was at my bike in a local open area, natural open area in Colorado, when I came across prairie dogs for the first time, and I was absolutely fascinated by them. I hadn't seen prairie dogs before, and it was only when I got back home I started thinking, oh, these could be really interesting species to study. And there's a number of things that lend themselves to that. The first being that they were locally abundant. They were found in lots of the natural open areas around Fort Collins, where I was based. Vocal communication, a range of different vocalizations, depending upon alarm calls and calling to kin. And so they're very active vocally. They're cognitively advanced, at least research suggests that they're able to make some pretty complex discriminations of different predators, be it terrestrial predators versus aerial predators, even distinguishing humans, and I'll come back to that later. They're obviously highly social. They're living in these colonies together, related individuals, generally in the same burrows, quite high densities. The colony living is great from the biologist's perspective because you return hopefully the same place and prairie dogs will be there because they're kind of rooted to those burrows. They don't just disperse over large distances, so you can go back to the same colony and conduct experiments. And they're keystone species from an ecological perspective. They're really important for the prairie. And actually, I just moved before moving to the US. Obviously, I was in Africa studying elephants, and I found, despite the size disparity, there's quite a lot of commonality between prairie dogs and elephants in terms of vocal communication, cognitively advanced and highly social. I saw a lot of commonality. So this was a species that I thought could be really interesting for studying, particularly as mammals so far, terrestrial mammals, hadn't had a great deal of focus to this point, which is pretty rare, biologically speaking. Often terrestrial mammals, particularly charismatic ones like elephants, probably get more than their fair share of attention. So just for those, I'm sure you're all very familiar, particularly those in the US where Colorado is, but I know there's a few British colleagues on listening into this talk as well. So there's Colorado highlighted in red, and Fort Collins is up in the north of the state where pretty much all the research was done around the city. So really keen to study the behavioural mechanisms that might be underpinning why animals are responding behaviourally to behaviourally and at the population level as well, right up the scale, but why they might be responding to noise. What is it that is triggering the changes that we see? And the first is that it's perceived as much as if there was an increased rate of or risk of predation in an area. We're seeing changes in their alert levels, their vigilance, a reduction in foraging, for example. So kind of predation risk hypothesis. The second, and these are not mutually exclusive, by the way, they could be multiple, they could be working in tandem with each other. We then think about the distraction hypothesis, and this posits that there is a finite amount of attention that any one animal can have. I'm certainly a good example of this, particularly at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, that if it's distracted by the introduction of another disturbance or a noise source, then the animal can't be attending to other things that are in the environment. Therefore, it could be a greater risk. So being distracted isn't the mechanism by which noise can affect animal behavior. We could have acoustical masking, which we talked about with the birds, which is where the low frequency noise produced by vehicle traffic, urban noise, actually masks the communication, really important communication, territorial information, mating calls, alarm calls, whatever it be, that don't get perceived by conspecifics, and therefore that alters behavior. So these three we wanted to kind of look at if we could in an experimental fashion. So the first work was, well, do prairie dogs alter their behavior at all in the presence of noise? And a lot of people thought, but some people that I discussed it with thought, well, maybe not, because they live all around urban areas and they're pretty tolerant, pretty robust little animals. They might not show any change in noise at all. So we did this first experiment at the Pawnee National Grassland and found 2 colonies that were in a fairly remote area, low levels of anthropogenic disturbance. It's an experimental grassland, so there hadn't been much shooting or anything like that. Despite that, the animals were very skittish. I had to observe them from a hide. But what I did essentially was play an hour of road noise recorded along I-25 and observe their behavior during that hour, sort of scan sampling all individuals within the 2 colonies. And then I would have a following a period of half an hour where there would be a break between the 2 experiments, and then a control period, also of an hour. The only difference being there was no noise broadcast. Those then were flipped on their heads, so that sometimes you start with the noise, sometimes you start with the control period, over 2 colonies over a 3-month period, recording this data repeatedly to see what happened. And yeah, and apologies for the clip art, the kind of PowerPoint clip art. I get a lot of, my wife teases me, it looks like they're doing synchronized jumping over upturned bowls, those prairie dogs, but hopefully it gives you an idea. There's a speaker on the right as well, which is slightly obscured in my view at the moment. Anyway, main story coming out of this is that we did see a response, and in the treatment, the foraging declined about 18%. So when they were in the treatment, they were foraging less, and vigilance almost doubled, increased 48%, I think was the amount. When they were present in the noise, we saw a lot more vigilance and reduced feeding, which was interesting. So there was a response going on. The other thing we saw is that and the control here is the black circles and the treatment is the grey ones, is that there were less animals above ground being active at any one point during the experiment. So they weren't spending as much time, they were spending more time down in the burrows, there was less animals active, which is intriguing. What I've also shown here is that temperature, because the thermoregulation by staying down in the burrows during the hottest part of the day, so you'd expect a decline in activity. And we saw that, but we saw it at very similar levels in both the treatment and the control. You can see the slopes are very similar, but consistently there was less animals above ground during the treatment. So some pretty marked effects of just being exposed to road noise in these 2 colonies. Next, we wanted to look at noise and the distraction. So there was evidence from some marine species, crabs and fish, that when exposed to noise, the detection of an approaching predator was greatly reduced, and therefore the predator could get closer, and obviously that could have huge fitness benefits. And I think the first work was done by Dan Bloomstein's group, who was across in UCLA, and looking at hermit crabs, quite an ingenious little experiment, just approaching the hermit crabs under the presence of oak noise and the absence of noise, and they found they could get a lot closer, the human observer, in the presence of noise than they could without. So we wanted to set up something similar with the prairie dogs. Now, and a site for this where we could actually have an approaching predator. Originally, I thought about doing something along the lines of like John Hoogland's stuff, where he actually has model predators that he drags through the colony. That was proving tricky, and again, it was just cycling, thinking, well, these natural areas around the town, the animals, the prairie dogs, are pretty used to people. In fact, they appeared to be completely habituated to runners, cyclists, walkers on the trails that crisscross these natural open areas. They don't pay any attention to them. They're busy foraging and feeding around. But if you step off the trail and approach them, they immediately alarm call and run to their burrows. So I thought, well, this could actually offer a pretty similar situation to the crab example, except I could be the approaching predator in this case, and I could broadcast noise of the road towards them, or I could have a control period where there was no noise but did exactly the same experiment. And the key thing being I would approach them in the same manner each time and note the alert distance, which was when the target animal became alert, and the flight distance is when they took flight towards their burrow. And I would drop, I had 2 bean bags, I would drop them at those 2 points and then measure the distance as accurately as possible afterwards. So this was my idea to do it, and the colony proved really great for that, because as I say, they paid no attention until you started to approach them. So I thought, well, this, I could do this in a really standardized manner. And I have to mention the amazing equipment that the technicians at the National Park Service came up with. So after my run-in with the patrol officer, this was even better. Now I had a briefcase that had a trigger, a keypad, and an aerial, and some wires. I mean, it just, yeah, if I looked dodgy before, I now looked even more dodgy. But what it did, what was great, was I could trigger the playback experiment to play from behind the grass away from the animals. It would slowly ramp up to be, after 2 minutes, to be playing the road noise at a reasonable level, not to cause them to take flight just from the noise. But I wasn't standing next to the speaker, so it wasn't confounding me. I was 60 meters up the pathway, and then I would approach from this angle, this oblique angle. And that was quite effective. I think Damon, who built this for me, the range on it was like 2.5 kilometers. He built it to a high spec. It wasn't quite necessary because I was only able to be just down the road, but it was great. These guys kind of fashioned this speaker for me, so which I was very appreciative of. And if we look at the results from this, we see, so pretty straightforward. Distance is the start distance on the left of figure A, which I started at. It was pretty evenly matched, although we obviously accounted for that in our analysis. And if you see, the alert distance actually increases in the treatment. Likewise, the flight distance is also increased in the treatment. So what's that saying? That's essentially the animals are becoming alert and taking flight more readily or quicker in the treatment when noise is present than they are in the control. So the opposite of what had been detected or shown in the crab species and some fish. They're actually more reactive. And figure B is just a corrected metric, which is basically taking flight distance from the alert distance. So the smaller the value, that means they're taking flight more quickly after the control. It's just in the corrected flight distance. So this was really intriguing. It wasn't seemingly distracting them at all. And anything, it was priming them to be more reactive to an approaching predator or intruder, in my case. Also, over time, I found, and you can see here, so the dotted line is the control. This is very much like the temperature graph that I just showed, that with increasing temperature, decreasing activity, but this is the distance, the corrected flight distance. And actually, they were taking flight ever more quicker over the course of the experiment. And what I think was going on here, and it's the same for both the control and the treatment, regardless of whether the noise, consistently the control had a greater distance, so there was still that effect, but both of them were declining over the course of the month and a half that the experiment ran. And it's a bit anecdotal, but my experience was, at first, I could do this experiment easily. As long as I stayed on the pathway, the animals were oblivious to me until I started the experiment, walked in, and then we'd get the response. Over time, though, when I started walking in, there was much more alarm calling, not to anyone else, it seemed, passing by, but to me. Call me nuts, but it did seem that it got more tricky to find a foraging prairie dog to use as my target animal, because they were getting alert as soon as I came in. And bear in mind, I was carrying these big speakers and all the equipment and microphones and everything else. Maybe I stood out. Maybe they have this individual recognition. And indeed, that has been the case. There's the work from Arizona University that looked at Gunnison prairie dogs actually being able to distinguish different predators and having different predatory calls. But they also did research that showed that they could distinguish different researchers depending upon the height of the researcher and the color of the t-shirts that they were wearing. That research has I think there's research more recently by John Hoogland that didn't find quite the same strength of those results, but still intriguing for an animal that's obviously got quite complex vocal communication and cognitive abilities that might be able to distinguish an individual. I don't have definitive evidence on this, but it did seem to me to get more difficult to do experiments over the course of the month that I was doing it. So yeah, so distraction hypothesis doesn't seem to hold. In fact, they seem to become more reactive once we're playing noise to them. That leads us on to the third, which is acoustical masking. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we had this seminal paper by Slabacorn and Pete in 2003 in Nature that suggested or showed evidence that in the presence of noise, great tit's song was actually increasing in an attempt, they believed, to evade the acoustical masking that is generated by the low frequency background noise of urban areas. And these great tits are obviously very successful urban species. So it's pretty fascinating that they have this flexibility or plasticity with their vocal behavior. And this has been studied extensively in bird species, but very little have been done in mammals, particularly at the point that we tried to do this experiment. So we thought, well, we could maybe do some of them first in, sorry, I should correct that, in terrestrial. Certainly there's been work done in marine mammals, but terrestrially, there hadn't been a great deal done. So again, using the prairie dogs, we were trying to think, well, how can we do this as an effective way to look at whether across a noise gradient or with increasing exposure to noise, whether the animals, prairie dogs, different prairie dogs, are changing the frequency of their calls. So from the success of the last experiment, when we were approaching them, we could elicit alarm calls as we approached. They nearly always alarm called when they became alert and then turned tail and ran. So Greta Wilson Henjum, who was a honors student at the time, helped with this research. In fact, she did all the data collection. And what she would do is arrive at one of 3 colonies, approach the prairie dog in question, measuring the distance at which it became alert and then called. And she also had a microphone, directional microphone, to record that alarm call. And she did that over the course from August to December 2014 for hundreds of prairie dogs, basically. So she put a huge amount of work in doing it on these colonies. And again, she could approach them to a certain degree because they were used to people moving along the trails. And we had 3 natural areas, as they called it, open areas across the city of Fort Collins. We had Pine Ridge, which we called the rural area, which was outside the city, on the city limits, basically, and was the quietest, around about a 30 decibel dBA level. From all the experiments we'd done there. Obviously that fluctuated, but it was around about 30. And then we had Coyote Ridge, which is alongside a pretty busy country road, which is close to the city, and then the Coterie, which was right on an intersection in the center of the town. It was pretty amazing. There was even a colony or a coterie of prairie dogs, and much higher levels of noise. 60 dBA was frequently measured, really noisy. So it allowed us to look at this kind of gradient of noise exposure and whether maybe we saw alarm calls increasing, as we might think with the communication of birds with song, that they are increasing the frequency. Do we see this with prairie dogs? So here's 2 spectrograms, one from the Pine Ridge area, the quieter one, you can see at the top there. And if you look at the bottom, you can see the calls, obviously the dark lines down the middle that extend from about 1,500 hertz right up to 16 almost in some cases. So it's going to be quite an extensive frequency range in the calls, the alarm calls, these chirps, these regular chirps. But what's interesting about these diagrams is the coterie. If you look at the bottom of the diagram, below 2 kilohertz, so the y-axis is measured in kilohertz. Below 2, you can see it's really dark on these spectrograms, and that's because there's a lot of background noise that's generated in low frequencies from urban noise, mainly vehicle traffic. So this is where we might think that maybe they'd shift up that minimum frequency to cope with that noise. And we had these 5 metrics: minimum frequency, that was the lowest level frequency that we could discern of the call, the 5% frequency, so that's the cumulative energy is 5% of the call, so the point at which the frequency where you've got the cumulative level of 5% of the energy. You've got peak frequency, so that's the point where the most energy in the call, the frequency. The duration of the call is just the length of time, and the maximum frequency, so the maximum frequency we could discern of that call from the spectrograms using Raven. And this was done with, Greta did a lot of the data extraction with the help of Megan McKenna, who was also part of the research team, and I worked with, she was at NPS along with Jesse when I was based at Colorado State, and they led this. And here's some results for 4 of our key metrics, and it's quite exciting because if you look at the top left, this is the minimum frequency metric, and at Pine Ridge, the quietest of the 3 colonies, we can see that the frequency is actually significantly lower than it is at Coyote Ridge and the Coterie, the noisier area. So by that makes you think that they're actually bumping up that minimum frequency. The increase isn't huge, you know, it's from 1100 hertz to 1250. That's not a massive difference, but it does seem like something is going on. But what is interesting is if you then look at the other metrics, there isn't a great deal of relation at all. In fact, there's nothing. And the one that tends to be a more robust metric of whether a frequency shift has occurred is the frequency 5%. This is easier to work out. It often doesn't get it doesn't get as obscured by a high signal to noise or a noise signal to noise ratio, which can be difficult to discern the minimum frequency, and it can be open to the observer effect, that people, if they're looking for an effect, they might report a higher minimum frequency, even though they're not intending to, because often it requires observers to work out where that minimum frequency lies. So the minimum frequency there has been some questions whether it is a good metric to be measuring if we're looking for these effects of changing vocal behavior. And if we would see it at the minimum frequency, we'd surely expect a frequency 5%, so where the 5% of the energy, that frequency level would also have shifted up, but we don't see that pattern. And that really is intriguing to us, and kind of there's a number of things here that we thought were interesting. One, again, that minimum frequency metric, I think caution needs to be taken with it. And we're not the first people to look into that. That had been mentioned before. Two, it's interesting that despite, the very high levels of noise exposure, they weren't changing the structure of the call, at least from a frequency perspective, or a duration for that matter. And that might be because they're alarm calls and they're made to conspecifics in a fairly small area. They're fairly spatially constricted how far they need to call, and the extent of the range of the calls extends well above the noise of, or at least most of the energy of, low frequency urban noise. So maybe it isn't a problem for prairie dogs in terms of alarm calling. We did find a relationship with the frequency 5% and the context of the call in terms of distance to the next nearest neighbor and distance to the predator. So that they changed the frequency and the amount of energy they were putting into the call, and probably an amplitude thing allowed their calling depending upon the risk to themselves and how close they were to other conspecifics. So there was a social component of the call, but it seemed to change depending on the context of risk and where they were in the colony, but it didn't seem to be related to the background anthropogenic noise that they're exposed to in terms of their alarm calls. So yeah, it's a bit of a complex one. Hopefully all that makes some sense. So returning to our behavioural mechanisms, we have acoustical masking, which Lana just talked about in terms of alarm calls. That doesn't seem to be explaining the changes in behaviour we're seeing in prairie dogs. They don't seem to be acoustically masked in terms of their alarm calls. Obviously, there's other forms of communication, and maybe it is giving them some acoustic information from other sources, even the approaching noise of a rustling predator potentially. But from what we saw with the alarm calls, acoustical masking wasn't playing a role. The distraction hypothesis, we feel that one also, that they are actually more reactive in the presence of noise, which, not being distracted in terms of spending time focusing on the noise or being drawn towards that so the predator could get closer, quite the opposite. And that plays into what we saw with the first experiment. It suggests that actually road noise seems to be playing a role as you would expect with increased predation risk, that they're not distracted more. In fact, they're becoming more acutely aware and taking flight quicker, which may have costs in itself, reduced foraging opportunities, the energetic expense of constantly running. These are animals that are living on a very fine energy budget, particularly towards the wintertime. And the same with our first study, which looked at the numbers of animals above ground foraging versus vigilant. That again, that seemed to be the case, that they were responding as if there was increased predation risk over time. Okay, so to conclude, I think what they proved to be a fascinating animal. I really enjoyed studying studying prairie dogs, and I hope to continue. They've still got some data we're working on, so there may be more studies, and still got the collaboration going with CSU. But in summary, I guess there's the first experimental evidence that road noise impacts the foraging and vigilance of a free-ranging mammal. It felt like this was some of the first evidence, and particularly one that is largely believed to be tolerant to disturbance in urban areas. I think it came as quite a surprise that they showed such a shift in their behaviour. And this is the thing, that we can assume because animals exist in their area, maybe urban areas, and seem highly adaptable, that there's no cost for being exposed to these pollutants or these specific types of disturbance. But that suggests that that isn't the case. These prairie dogs are there maybe because urbanization has taken place so rapidly in the colonial, they haven't had the chance to move, or they can't move to a new area. And actually these urban prairie dogs are actually highly susceptible to disease and disturbance, and often colonies can go extinct. So I think that the work also shows that despite the fact that they're in these areas, that they are susceptible to noise and other forms of human disturbance. And it also has implications for just more disturbance sensitive species, I think. The other thing is that we didn't find any evidence of habituation over the course of the 3-month experiment, the first one. Now, 3 months isn't a huge period of time, but we thought, doing repeated experiments with noise introduction and control, that we would see a declining response, but we didn't. So that's interesting. And this kind of indicates that importance of doing longer term research as well, because the habituation question is really interesting. If they're constantly exposed to this disturbance, at what point do they become tolerant or habituated to that response, that disturbance? And we didn't, as I said, we didn't appear to detect any distraction from the introduction noise. In fact, they became more reactive, and their alarm calls didn't seem to alter the acoustic metrics in terms of the frequency with increasing background noise. So I'm just noticing it's getting close to 6 o'clock here, so that must mean my hour is almost up. So I shall stop there. Thank you very much for coming along, listening. Any questions? More than happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you, Graeme. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them, or you can put it in the chat and I will read it off for Graeme.
Thanks for coming along, everyone. And sorry if I spoke too fast. It's a thing I do, I think, just especially the weird British accent voice.
That was great.
Cool. Glad you enjoyed it.
No, any questions right now? Okay. Oh, here we go. Let's see. What is the relevance of A weighting? Do they have similar hearing to humans?
Yeah, a good point. Relevance. We discussed this quite a lot, whether it should be A weighting or not. It seems we don't have an accurate hearing threshold data for prairie dogs themselves, but similar species, I'm trying to remember which one it was that we went on, but did have a somewhat similar threshold. I think it extends higher than the human threshold in terms into the higher frequencies, but it wasn't dissimilar. And so we set on a kind of as a default, went for the A. There was a thought about doing it on flat with a Z, but we went with the A in the end. But that is an interesting point. We don't actually have the hearing thresholds or particularly accurate for the black-tailed prairie dog that I was working on.
And I don't remember, Graeme, did you guys record in the ultrasound range? Because I know some research has shown for at least ground squirrels at a certain distance, if the predator is present at a certain distance, they're more likely to produce a call in ultrasound range versus the more audible range. Did you guys go?
Oh, so actually shifting into the very high frequencies. We saw a shift in frequencies depending upon where the distance to the predator, and they were shifting the frequencies. I gotta get this right now. It's a few years since I did this. They were shifting frequencies higher if the predator was closer. Which kind of would suggest that could be something. I didn't know about that they can actually shift it up into the ultrasonic.
Yeah.
And it wasn't that marked, but it was a couple of hundred hertz that they were shifting it up because that was the effect we were seeing. It wasn't from background noise. It was on the social and predatory context of the recording.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do we have any further questions for Graeme today? And the recording will be up later. Okay, here I have a few coming in. Okay, first, could the increase in observed minimum frequency be caused by an increase in background noise?
Yes, I think with the minimum frequency, absolutely. I think that's what's going on. I think our detector wasn't good enough. The signal to noise ratio was causing a problem for it actually to detect that very. It's quite hard to work out what the minimum frequency ultimately is unless you have quite a quiet background, a quite distinct call. And I think it was getting lost in that, particularly at the coterie with the very high levels of noise. I think discerning that minimum frequency. And I think that's been the concern is A, the observer effect, and B, the signal to noise ratio can make the minimum frequency very difficult to discern. And we might be getting slightly inflated results. And there's a couple of other papers that have looked at that as well in recent years. Yeah, fully agree with that.
Next question. Have you partnered with endocrinologists to look at cortisol levels and calling?
No, absolutely would love to have done something physiologically. I think that would have been really fascinating. Kurt Fristrup was a mentor supervisor on this project, was very keen that we get metrics to look at the physiology as well as the behavior. Stress on, we're also trying to think of ways of doing like heart rate measurements, being exposed to noise to kind of look at fear responses and things like that. We didn't manage it, but I really like to. I'd love to take that kind of thing on. I think prairie dogs would be absolutely ideal for it. As again, for the various reasons I spelled out in the talk, getting relatively close to them and getting those metrics whilst not having too much of an impact on their behavior directly is feasible.
And there's a comment leading up. after that, it says certain animals who have high levels call more often, and cortisol and fecal studies are easy. So I know I talked to Kurt about that too, because that was one of the interests I had as well. And
I think maybe, I think you probably spoke to me about it, because I remember chatting, because you've got experience in that, and that would have been great. We probably should have done. I think it was trying to work out because we're doing it fecally, is trying to work out which feces belongs to which animal. Ultimately, maybe catching animals, and that's what they do with the marmot study up in Lena, my wife was involved in the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory up in Gothic, Colorado, which is amazing. They've done this 50-year data set as they catch animals and take blood and everything else. And yes, it's slightly invasive, but they get this amazing physiological and behavioral data set, as well as the population level demography over time, where they're marked individuals. John Hoogland's the expert in that with prairie dogs.
So clearly there's a lot more we can study with mammals. We just kind of have to expand the taxa we're studying.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of like ground squirrels. I think they were amazing. It really was. And it wasn't the intention of the work. The work was, I don't remember Jesse when I arrived, there was all these ideas we could have done. And I actually started off thinking about working on mule deer. There was a big project going on, which I was leading, who's still based at CSU, looking at mule deer and the effects of the expanding gas and oil infrastructure across the West. And we thought we could set up some big experimental noise, basically setting up drill rigs without the drill rig, just the sound. And it would have been great because there was collared deer moving around. But it was actually the big challenge with that. And what really frustrated me, because I'd done all these playbacks in Africa, but was actually finding a way of setting up a rig of noise that would play 24 hours a day, and finding a solution to the battery issue. I was trying to remember, who was it that did the bat study, the PhD? Katie, yeah, Katie managed to do it, but she was doing it at night time and would charge the batteries, but it was really logistically challenging, so we didn't follow through with that. But I still think that would be a great study, looking at it on large mammals that are collared.
Yeah, so if any engineers out there have ideas to help out with that.
Yeah, anyone's keen. I'm always up for those kind of things.
Okay. Oh, Ian has a question. Go ahead. Thank you.
Hey, so I thought it was really interesting that you found like an increase in kind of sensitivity of the prairie dogs to like an approaching person over time, because it's like so often in animals you find like the exact opposite. And so I know you were saying that their reaction in terms of like distance they reacted was reduced with noise. And I may have missed this, but did the kind of rate of their I guess like increase in sensitivity to approaching person differ between like the control and the noise? You might have presented on that, but
yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, we saw this. We saw this increasing sensitivity, but it seemed to parallel for both. So from a perspective of the results of the noise study, it was kind of good because the same response, but they were getting more and more reactive, seemingly, and I guess I'm going to be really cautious with this, to my presence. And it's interesting because work done by Seth Magel, he used to walk in repeatedly to the same prairie dog colony to see response over time. Similar sort of thing, but he was looking at the colony level. And he just found that they became more and more sensitized. They didn't become habituated to him just walking into an urban colony repeatedly. Different type of work, but it does seem, I think, this gets at, if you've got a lot of predators and you're a lot of risk, like a small mammal, like a prairie dog is, maybe habituation in this sense might not be the greatest move. So they're habituating to certain things, but there's a point at which that risk it's too unpredictable. So the people moving along the pathways may be fine, but there's one individual who keeps coming in. Is he suddenly going to run and grab one of us? I don't know. They do suffer predation from all angles, it feels like, prairie dogs. So yeah, a really good point. Sensitization, it did seem, obviously would need to extend that. It was a kind of side part of the study. I just felt like this is getting really difficult to do. Why is that the case?
Great.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.
Okay, so it looks like we're at 1 o'clock right now. So if nobody else has any more questions, thank everybody. Thank you guys all for coming to our last presentation, and thank you, Graeme, for joining us all the way from Wales. It was a great talk. And like I said, the recording will be up on the CARE website probably in a day or two. So thank you guys.
Great. Well, nice to meet you all. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
bye,
it's
Jesse.
great seeing you again, Graeme. Yeah.
Bye.